Welcome everybody to our session on methods in open science. For those of you who know my particular work, you may be wondering why I'm talking about, in a session about the future of methods in psychology, why I'm not talking about Bayes. I figure I get a break from talking about p-values and all of that for at least one Psychonomics conference. So I'm going to talk about open science, and in particular an initiative that all of the presenters that you'll see today have been a part of. So, and then we'll have a session. Rolf Vanpaemel will talk about empirical results, trying to get open data from scientists. Rolf will talk about publishing, and Steve Lewandowsky will talk about some of the possible pitfalls in open data. So let me talk about the peer reviewers' openness initiative. I want to start by thanking all the people that are involved with the peer reviewers' openness initiative that I'm going to talk about. This includes the 300 supporters that we already have online. So you can check the website, you can see who those people are. But also all of the peer reviewers openness initiative co-authors, some of whom are here and some of whom are not. But as you can see here, other than me, there's also 12 other co-authors. So thank you to all of them for making this possible. So let's talk about publishing our work. Let's start with a multiple choice poll. Why do we publish our scientific work? Is it, one, to make the publishers wealthy? We're doing a pretty good job of that, but I don't think that's really the primary purpose. Is it increasing our own scientific status? What about describing what we did and what was found in our scientific work for the universal good? I think a lot of people think of that as being the primary purpose of publishing our scientific work. But it could also be for the greater glory of God. That's another possibility. Now, actually, the first two are obviously absurd, I think. Back in 1665, when the very first issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society were published, 3 and 4 were explicitly given as the purpose of starting that journal, of using the printing press to publish scientific work, right? Now, we all know that we have replaced our university, we've replaced God with the university, because we have to do well in our national research evaluations. But let's think about how things have changed in the past 350 years. I love this. I absolutely love this. This is an article in the very first issue of the transactions of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. An account of a very odd, monstrous calf. And this is it. That is, somebody wrote in to talk about this weird calf. So I'm thinking maybe I can publish a paper like this, about some weird seagull I see somewhere. That would be sort of fun, but we can't do this anymore, right? Our papers have a lot more detail. We have figures. Many of us release data. We do statistical analyses. Publishing is very different. But the principle of openness, that is, the whole point of publishing is to tell people what we did and what happened, has not changed. The National Academy of Sciences says this: the act of publishing is a quid pro quo in which the authors receive credit and acknowledgement in exchange for disclosure of their scientific findings. An author's obligation is not only to release data and materials to enable others to verify or replicate published findings, as journals already implicitly or explicitly require, but also to provide them in a form on which other scientists can build with future research. Because we all know that science is cumulative, and we want to enable that. All members of the scientific community whether working in academia, government, or commercial enterprise, have equal responsibility for upholding community standards as participants in the publication system, and all should be equally able to derive benefits from it, right? So openness is a core principle in science. I think we all understand that. And it's important that this is why we publish. This is part of the deal when we publish. So that hasn't changed. So let's talk about openness and how it, and modern science and how this sometimes manifests itself. Well, we want to be open, right? Scientists endorse Merton's norms, including communality, at very high rates when you poll them. Science is a social activity in which we share things like data and materials and the like. We want others to be open. If you poll scientists and you ask them, have you been negatively impacted in your research by people not sharing things? A majority of, Vogeli et al., a majority of scientists said, yes, I have been negatively impacted by somebody not sharing when I have asked them. But we're not open. And Rolf will talk about this, but data on request is the default, and even when you request it, you often don't get it, more often than not, as it turns out. So here's the social dilemma. As scientists, we value openness, right? That this is a part of what we consider science to be, being open. We're here at a conference sharing our research, right? Openness is a core part of what we do. As evaluators and consumers of research, we want openness. This is what we want to happen. But as authors, we may not feel that it's actually in our best interest to be open. Why would that be? Well, as authors, we have incentives not to be open. Because one, we're in some sense in competition with other people, and that openness may not be reciprocated, right? We may share our data, and then what if somebody else doesn't share theirs? We've lost some sort of competitive advantage. Openness definitely takes time, right? So you want to publish a paper, and then you say, well, I would ideally like to share these data, but I have to figure out how to use the data repository. I have to actually upload them. I have to make a document which makes clear what columns are what, right? I mean, this is not trivial. It takes time. And then, of course, our main incentives are hiring and funding, and openness may not be rewarded there, right? So as authors, we may not feel that it's in our best interest to be open. But we have two roles, right? We're authors, and we have incentives, but we're also evaluators of research. We're reviewers as well. We're part of the peer review system. And we have incentives to ask other people to share, right? Because we want to encourage better science. We want to get others to share their data, right? We actually want to avoid extra review workload, and so if we can say, maybe I don't want to review papers that don't give all the details, I might be able to reduce my extra workload by reviewing things that are actually higher scientific quality. And of course, I want to see possible mistakes, right? Being able to see data allows you to dig into a piece of research and possibly find mistakes, possibly reinterpret things. We want to be able to do that as reviewers, evaluators of research. So what is the peer reviewers' openness initiative? Our idea was to use the fact that we have incentives as reviewers to overcome the fact that as authors, we might not have those same incentives. So the idea, it's a bit small, but I'll go through this, is that when you receive a review request, what you do is you immediately fire off an email to the editor saying, will you please ask the authors whether they will open or publicly release their data and materials? And if they won't, will they just give a reason in the paper for instance, the author know why they won't do that. Because, of course, there are good reasons why sometimes you might not do that, so just give a reason, right? Now, if you don't get a positive response to that, if the authors say, no, we're not going to give you a reason and we're not going to release our data, then what you do is you say, okay, I am not going to give you a comprehensive review of this paper. I will give you a short review that focuses on the manuscript and openness, but I'm not going to give you a comprehensive review. If you say, sure, I will publicly release the data, or I'll just give you a reason why, then I'll give you a comprehensive review. So how do you ask about openness? All you have to do is just, as I said, write to the editor and say, will the authors publicly provide the data and materials underlying the paper? And if not, will they justify that decision? And then publish that justification in the paper. And this is an important part of the peer reviewers' openness initiative. The justification from our perspective doesn't matter. It can be, I was too lazy to put this online. It can be, I'm an alien from the planet Zork 3, and we don't do that, right? The important thing here is that you require that justification to be in the published paper. Now, if they want to say that they're an alien from Zork 3 in a published paper and they want to get that past an editor, fine, right? From our perspective, put it in there. Knowing that that's your justification will be valuable information for the rest of us to evaluate your research. So, what is a non-comprehensive review? A non-comprehensive review is one where you just focus on that aspect of the research that is an open, right? You say something like, because the purpose of a scientific paper is to describe what was done and what happened, and the authors haven't done this, I can't really fully evaluate this, and readers of this article will not be able to fully evaluate that, right? So I can't really give you full evaluation of this research. I think it's lacking something very important. Keep in mind that this is something similar to what some of you might have done. I've done it. Sending an email to authors saying, oh, this figure is missing, right? I can't really review this because this figure is missing. Can you put in this figure and then send it to me again? That's all we're asking, right? So, non-comprehensive review. Focus on open science. And this starts in January of 2017, so we give people some time to sign up and to get used to the idea. So there's a paper that was just published in the Royal Society of Open Science that talks about this. It has a lot more discussion than I can get into here. We talk about possible critiques. It's an open access paper, so it's free. And there's a website, opennessinitiative.org, where there's details about how to implement open science, and there's a signatory page where you can sign up. So what are you doing when you sign up? What you're saying is, I support this idea, and I'm going to do this starting in January. That's what you're doing. Why would you do this? Well, the idea is that we have collective action, so other people know that there are lots of other people who support this idea, and you're not just acting on your own when you do a review like this. So we think that the idea of collective action is powerful. So in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to try to speed through some possible critiques of the peer reviewers' openness initiative. Number one, my research isn't open. Would I be a hypocrite if I did this? I don't think so. The idea is to increase the quality of the scientific literature. And if you have that in mind, then you really should be thinking about whether these papers that you're reviewing are open. Now, you can make a choice of whether you are also going to be open, but I think it's okay to do this in review and then hope that somebody else holds you to account on this as well, right? And then eventually, we'll all be more open, right? Isn't this a journal policy question? I don't think so. I mean, it can be implemented as a journal policy, but it's a scientific norm. I think policy is best when it has some sort of ideological reason for existing, unless it's a silly policy question like we use APA format, right? We can implement openness in some sort of policy in a journal, but the question of whether we as reviewers should be asking people to be open, that's really a scientific question, and reviewers are responsible for scientific quality. Let's see, I'm going to skip a bit so that I can answer some questions. Let's see. What if some authors can't comply for ethical or legal or practical reasons? This is totally fine, right? Not all research can be open. This is a fact. There are all kinds of ethical reasons, like this is a small population, and even releasing anonymized data might be dangerous, or have legal reasons. For instance, my stimuli are copyrighted by somebody else, and I can't release them. But there are also practical reasons. My data set is 500 terabytes, and I can't stick this on a website, right? All you have to do is give a reason, right? That's it. You just give a reason. And so that's the idea. I'll open it up for questions now. So we have 5 minutes for questions. So maybe if you want to ask about any of these, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
Yeah, so you said that you would tell an action editor that you could not do the review without the data, but does that mean that you are basically going to download the data as a reviewer and doing the analysis to check the code and so on? Are you really going to do this?
Thank you for asking that, because that's right here. And the answer is maybe. So, as a reviewer, I think that part of my responsibility is thinking about readers and what they might want to do, right? I mean, we already do this, right? I don't think the potential readers of this article are going to understand what you're talking about. Please revise your paper, right? So, it's not necessary that you do those analyses, right? You could. Having the ability to do them is important, right?
But didn't you say that this would be what you would tell the action editor, that you can't do a good review without having access to this data?
So, what I said was that that's a possibility. I could say that. It depends on the situation.
Okay.
But to say that I believe that a good manuscript should have this as part of it, that's a different thing from saying that I need the data to do this review. Right? Bob, and then yeah.
One of the major issues, a practical one from the reviewer perspective, and that is if you get 2 or 3 requests to review manuscripts per week,
yeah.
Then what would you recommend? Is it the case that we would turn down more requests for review? Because we're not full-time reviewers.
Yeah.
We have day jobs as well. And reviewing is done on a voluntary basis,
yeah.
and rarely considered in the evaluation of our work within universities. And so one of the problems is just the sheer volume of reviewing that has to be done.
Yeah.
So while we might support the general idea of reviewing papers along with looking at data and analyses, the majority of people just wouldn't have the capacity to do that properly, given the volume of manuscripts have to be reviewed. Right,
so you don't have to actually use the data in review. What you're saying is that in order to be a manuscript of sufficient quality, it should have this alongside the manuscript, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do those analyses. So we think that one of the strengths of this initiative is the fact that this could actually reduce your review load, right? You send this boilerplate content to the editor, and they send it to the authors, and the authors say, no, we're not going to do that. Or the editor says, never mind, I don't like the fact that you need open data. And then you have gotten out of doing that review, right?
That may work initially, but if you're successful, that gets out this won't exist.
Sorry?
If you're successful, that gets out is going to reduce as a possibility, because more and more authors will comply.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. We want more and more authors to comply. It's temporary.
And the reviewers can't use that as a reason for rejecting the invitation to review.
And then for a short period of time, we have reduced our workload and we've made the world a better place 2 years down the road. And we're back in the same situation we were, but we have more open science.
A more difficult place to do work, actually.
Well, with open science?
Yeah, just because of the sheer workload that would be involved.
I don't understand what workload.
Oh, if you're successful in increasing the number of authors that provide open data,
Yep.
and the expectations, the reviewer will check that the open data are available, and start to look at if there are mistakes in the data, for example, then in order to do that job thoroughly, it will take a lot longer than reviewing a manuscript without looking at the data. Now, if every author is doing that, it means the capacity to undertake reviews is going to reduce.
So what you're saying, though, is that we are actually reviewing too many papers to do them well, right?
Yes.
That's what you're saying.
Yes.
That's totally true. We have too many papers to review, and we can't do a good job. And if we had, if that were part of the normal flow, and I think we should be reducing our reviewer workload to an amount that means that we can do a quality job, and that may sometimes involve looking at the data. Well, that's just something we'll have to face, right? I think that just saying, well, we shouldn't have open data because then we would feel like we would have to look at the data and we might do a better job, and doing a better job takes more time.
The thing is, it could have an effect that you're not expecting, an unintended consequence, and that is if experts are more likely to reject an invitation to review because of the reviewer overload.
That's a second question. I'm not going to let you have that one. Because we have to go on to the next talk.
That reduces the quality of the review that takes place.
Let's talk about that in the discussion later, because we have to move on to the next talk. So, thank you. Sorry. Do you want me to take over for you?
So good afternoon, everybody.
Okay. I just get the
I'm going to, as Richard foreshadowed already, I'm going to talk about the availability of psychological research data. A lot of people would agree, or do agree, that having open data benefits science. There was a study about 5 years ago, and one of the items in the study was the following: the lack of access to data generated by other researchers or institutions is a major impediment to progress in science. And this question was asked to about 1,300 respondents, and about 70% of the people agreed with that statement. That's not that shocking. Why? There are a lot of benefits of open data to science. Open data allows you to reanalyze the data, so you can verify other people's results. You can do secondary analysis. You can use the same data to answer a different question than the original authors asked. It facilitates meta-analyses, it facilitates alternative analyses, like doing a robustness check, for example. If you're interested in doing a pre-registered replication, having the original data helps. It's useful as a training tool. There are many benefits, scientific benefits of open data. So that's the reason about 70% of the people agreed with these statements. These are specific benefits. On a more general level, open data makes science more reliable. It makes the scientific results more reliable. Why? They can be verified, they can be checked. It increases the confidence in scientific results, in particular for one paper, and the confidence in science in general. It makes science more efficient. You don't have to, if you want to study a question for which data exists already, you can use that data if they're open to study your question, so it's less wasteful, it costs less money, we use our resources better if we open up our data after a publication. So altogether, it accelerates scientific progress. Even besides these benefits, some people also think, and I would agree, that for publicly funded research, that open data should be, or morally obliged to be there, because they should be public property. They're paid by the public money, so they should be in the public. That's at the scientific level. Are there also benefits for an individual scientist? There are a bit less, but there are a few. It prevents losing your data. If you put it somewhere online, on, for example, the Open Science Framework, there's one go-to place. You can go if you're looking for your data 5 years later. You lost your computer, your old computer is gone, but your data are still there. You don't have the problems that a lot of people face, as we will see in a couple of minutes. There's some research that shows that it increases your citations, it increases the attention that other people give to your work. Why? You give more in your paper. You don't not just give your hypothesis and your results, but you give things that people are interested in, the data that they can use for a meta-analysis, secondary analysis, and so on. It increases your visibility. It increases possibilities of collaboration, and for some people it gives a warm feeling of doing the right things. So that's the theory. A lot of people value open data. There are good reasons for having open data, but now let's turn to the practice. Because of the benefits, several journals and associations require, or at least encourage, to have open data that come with publication. But is this really the case? How much of the research data are really available? I dig into the literature to give an answer to this question, but it immediately turned out that it's actually a quite hard question to solve, because the terms data availability and data sharing is rather underspecified. It means many things. When should you share data? When do you look at data sharing? Should data shared before the publication? It's what Jeff Rauber calls the born open data, or after publication, or after several months, data with an embargo. Shared with who? Publicly, to the general audience, or only privately to your immediate collaborators, or to one or two scientists you know that ask for your data. If it's privately, anybody that asks good data, or only with academics, or people from industry, or layperson, there's a lot of different types of being open. Under which conditions? Unconditionally, only if they offer you co-authorships, or is there a possibility for collaboration, only when it's used for verification, but not, say, for a meta-analysis. You can be open only for verification, but not for other things, only when people give you money, and so on. It happens. Which data should be open? Summary data, raw data, and what's the context? Should the data, are the data open when there's a journal that requires it, or even when the journal doesn't require it? So there are lots of possibilities, lots of combinations. So I don't think I've come across a study that defined data sharing in exactly the same way. So that's a bit of a disclaimer for the rest of this talk. So I looked first at self-reported data sharing. What is self-reported data sharing? You just ask a bunch of researchers, do you share your data? Or are you willing to share your data? I looked into the literature, and I gave here the references I used here. This is not my research. There's a study that finds that in general science, so not zoomed into some sub-disciplines, the sharing rate is between 30 and 60%. So between 30 and 60% of the researchers say, okay, I'm happy to share my data. There are quite a few differences across disciplines. For example, in atmospheric sciences, the sharing rate, or the self-reported sharing rate is between 90 and 96%. In biology, it's between 85 and 94%. In computer science, between 64 and 90. And in medicine, between 65 and 75. So these numbers look quite okay if you're a proponent of open data. But if you then look at reality, if you look at actual data sharing, things look quite different. So what's actual data sharing? Just looking how many data sets are available. and that can again mean publicly available or available on request. There are different studies. I didn't find a number for all the disciplines here, but there's one study that again looks at science in general without looking at the subdisciplines, and it finds that only about 10% of the data are publicly available. So between 30 and 60% of the people say I share, but in practice only about 10% of the people share their data. In medicine, there's about 65 to 75% of people who say I share, but only 10% of the people actually do share. In economy, I didn't find a number in economy on the reported sharing rate, but the actual sharing rate is between 20 and 44%. So looking at these numbers, you could suspect it's also lower, the actual sharing rate, than the reported sharing rate. So the actual sharing rate is a lot less than reported sharing rate in a relative sense, but also really quite low. 9%, 10%. Here 44, it's quite okay, but still it's low if you value open data. So what about psychology? I didn't find a percentage of self-reported sharing in psychology, so I cannot really compare there. There's one study that looks at self-reported sharing in social sciences, and there it's about 60% of the researchers who say that they share their data. Remember, these figures, if you compare it with these figures, which were also self-reported sharing rates, we're quite low in the social sciences. But this number, as you might recall by now, it doesn't mean that much. What really matters is the actual sharing rate. And luckily in psychology, there is quite some research on the actual sharing rate. And the first of these studies, or at least the first of these studies that I know of, was done more than 50 years ago by Wollens. They contacted 37 authors with journal articles that appeared in the APA journal between 1995 and 1961 and asked to share their data. And only 9 of the authors shared their data under a reasonable set of conditions, without asking money, without asking co-authorship. So that's 24% actual sharing rate 50 years ago. 10 years later, this study was done again by Greg and Rees. They contacted 53 authors, again from 4 different APA journals for one specific issue, and they asked the data to do a reanalysis. What did they find? 20 of those 53 authors shared their data, so that's 38%. It's a bit more than the 24 from Mullins. Here you see a breakdown for each of the journals. There's the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology had a sharing rate of 75%, which is quite high. But in this study, they didn't just look at the raw data, but also at summary analyses. So that comes back at my point that it's really hard to compare studies. They all define sharing a bit differently. So, and if you take that into account, this is again not such a positive picture that's painted here. But of course, these studies were done a long time ago. It was a totally different time. And there's a quote from the Greg and Rees paper that makes it quite clear. They say that in some cases, the only copy of the data was sent. So you should imagine 40 years ago, you had your data on a paper. If a colleague asked you to show the data, you should either send those data and you lost your own data, or you should make copies, and it takes a lot of work, and it's all a mess. But even in the time of that mess, there was about a 24 to 38% sharing rate. These days, of course, we have internet, sharing is made easy, so you would think because it's so easy now compared to 40 or 50 years ago, these things should have changed for the better. Well, let's see. 10 years ago, in 2005, Richard and his colleagues requested data from 141 papers, again, for several APA journals, these APA journals. They were interested in reanalyzing the data to study the effects of outliers. What did they find? These are their results. The most interesting piece of advice are here, the data shared after the first request and after the reminders, and together it sums up to 27%. So 27% of the authors shared the data. So that's about the same percentage as Wollens found in 62. So having all the technical limitations gone, it didn't really change. But you could say 2005 is also a totally different time. I remember in 2011 we had the crisis of confidence, you had the Vanpaemel, the Stapel affair, the false positive psychology paper. So a lot of people start to think about the state that psychology is in, and part of the solution that some people offer is more focus on open data. There have been a number of papers, symposia, initiatives. There's the Center for Open Science, the Open Science Framework, all these kind of things that we realize now, and maybe didn't in 2005, that make us realize that open data are important. So we would again expect things got better thanks to the crisis of confidence. Let's see. So now our work comes in November 2013, so in the midst of the crisis. We requested raw data again for 4 different APA journals, and we had about 400 papers. We contacted about 400 authors. Our aim was to compare a frequentist analysis, which was done in the paper, to a Bayesian analysis, which was what we supposed or planning to do, or still planning to do. So what are the results? We received about 150 positive responses. So that's 38%. There's a quite large variation, and if you look at journals, the journal with the highest sharing rate was Emotion. About half of the researchers there that we contacted shared the data, but there was also, say, in the Journal of Neuropsychology, that was 25%. So the same rate as what Rollins found, the same rate as 50 years ago when sharing was really difficult. We're still here, at least for some journals. And even for the best journals, it's only 50% that shares. If you look at the pie chart, these two here combine into the 38%. The main difference with Wicketshout in 2005 is here this big chunk of no reply. In his research it was about 14%, we have 41%. So if things changed after the crisis of confidence, is that people don't reply to emails anymore. So the sharing rate has increased a little bit compared to Wickett. So you could say that's a good thing, and it's really too optimistic. I'm not that optimistic. Why? Remember, these were all APA journals, and APA journals have these ethical principles that explicitly state that if another researcher asks for data for analysis, which is exactly what we did, we should give it. So even in this situation where people should give it, they don't. So it is an overestimate of the real sharing rate. Another reason why I'm not that optimistic is that only 4 authors shared their data by giving us a link to their own website or to the Open Science Framework. So they gave the data to me, so I have them now, but none of you has these data. Only 4 of the data sets we got are publicly available. So the actual sharing rate that's of main interest, which is the public one, is depressingly low. A lot of people didn't reply, so I have no idea why they don't want to give their data. Some people did reply and didn't give the data, and they explained why, and there were broadly 2 main categories. Some of them said they were not allowed to share data because of privacy issues or security issues. I have no idea what they mean actually, but with privacy issues I can understand. Or they were willing to share the data, but they couldn't do it because they lost access to their own data. They didn't have time to do it. They said it takes too much effort, and all this. For some people I believe it, for some people I don't. For the people, for those people for which it's the real reason, it really reflects that they have poor archiving and documentation practices. If you do it well, if you archive your data well, sharing data doesn't cost time at all, or isn't that much work at all. I have 20 more seconds. Let's see what I'll have to say. Let's all sign the PRO initiative. One thing I really would like to have, and it links up with the PRO initiative, I would really like to, and then after it's all finished, to have an open science statement in journals. What do I envision with that? It's a standard section, just like an abstract or references, that explains either where the data are or why you don't share them. Why do I think this is important? A lot of people want to share. 150 authors sent me the data, but they didn't share it publicly because a thing they didn't think about. They just didn't think, it's not their habit to sign the data. If you have to fill in this section, saying where are your data or why don't you share them, then at least they think about, hey, I can share it. It's an option, and they might do it. So these kind of sections will break the habit of not thinking about not sharing the data. And if they don't want to share the data, and it's a deliberate choice, then it's totally okay. But it should be a deliberate choice of not sharing, not just an old habit that should die. Thank you for your attention. I'm open to questions. Yes?
So this is what level range which involve either sound or video recordings, which are very clearly potentially breaching privacy. What's the general stance about that?
Can you repeat the question? Can you repeat the question?
Yes, there's a question about when there's serious privacy issues, like when there are videos. You have to be on the or sound recording. We should be on the safe side. If there's any reason not to share data, don't share them. I'm really okay with that. But I'm really against these people who don't have any problem sharing, but don't do it because they don't have the habit of sharing it, or they don't know how to do it, but if you have issues like privacy issues, I understand them, and that's totally no problem. Some privacy issues you can solve by anonymizing, some you can't, and then as a case in point in our paper that I just talked about, where we asked the 400 hours of data, we didn't share the data. It's a paper on sharing, and we didn't share the data. Why? Because I think there are privacy issues. I don't want to have a witch hunt where people could see this author shared and this didn't. We did write it and justify it in the paper. We say we're not sharing the data for this reason. And that's, for me at least, it's totally okay if you do it like that. It's compatible with the peer reviewers' openness initiative. Richard was a reviewer, by the way, on the paper, so we kind of had to. It's open review, so you can all see. That's no problem for me at least. Yes.
It seems like the most elegant way to get people to share data is if funding agencies, which requires, like some funding agencies require papers to be open access within a year or so. Are there any funding agencies? Are you in contact with them? I mean, it seems like this is the quick way. I mean, once they require it, you have to do it, and they problem solve.
I think, but maybe American people here know it better than the NIH.
Yes, our students as well, don't they?
I'll talk about that in my talk.
Oh, perfect.
But one comment about just requiring it doesn't solve it, because a lot of journals require it, but there are studies that showing that even when it's required, people don't do it. So you have to must be some mechanisms that people actually check whether the policy is followed.
Then in the next grant application problem.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yes, maybe the final one.
We need to go on.
Very large, 41% who never, among this very large 41% who never replied. Did you check for how many of these actually the data is simply downloadable, and then many people annoyed that you didn't check before you to be honest, that might be what I would do. You have a paper and at the end it says, here you can download the data, and somebody emails me saying, where can I find the data? If I'm busy, I might think, yeah, come on, read the paper.
You wouldn't, no one answered us. So even the people who did share the data online already, they didn't say, come on, do your work. They explained it was part of a big project and stuff. So I hope people wouldn't be that annoyed. But I don't think it was together with some master students, and I don't think they explicitly did it, but they read all the papers to see whether there were p-values and blah blah, because they were necessary to do the Bayesian analyses. So they didn't just look at the emails, they also skimmed the paper. So I think the chances are small that there are a lot of people in that situation. Okay, thank you again, and give the floor to Rolf.
Open review, knowing how the sausage is made. I wasn't quite happy with that title. I didn't think it was appropriate, so I changed it a little bit. And I'm going to introduce somebody that Richard has talked about already, Henry Oldenburg, who was a theologian, which explains maybe the focus on God in your fourth option. He was a diplomat and a natural philosopher, but he also was the creator of peer review. Again, in the Philosophical Transactions, about 350 years ago, he was the editor and also the reviewer. Later on, review committees were formed, and they consisted of groups of editors that were, of course, affiliated with the journals. Later on, and now we're talking centuries later, independent peer reviewers were solicited, or not solicited, were invited to review manuscripts for journals, and this became common in the mid-20th century. Now, during those times, we've seen different forms of peer review. There's double-blind peer review, in which the author is not known to the reviewers are not known to the author, and everybody's known to the editor. Single-blind review, which is, I think, maybe the most common form of review in cognitive psychology, is where the reviewers are not known to the author, but the author is known to the reviewer, and again, the editor is omniscient, knows everything. The third form of review, which is becoming more common and is sort of consistent with the overall theme today, openness, is open or transparent review. Strictly speaking, open review is where the editor knows everyone and the author does and the reviewers do. Transparent means that the reviews are also published. They're available to the broader research community. And so is this something we want? Well, let's first look at some issues with closed reviews. So those are reviews that are not open to the general community. And we can look at that from the perspective of an author and from the perspective of a reviewer. And if we look at it from the perspective of an author, then we only have to click and go to this website where we see excerpts from actual reviews that people are unhappy with those reviews post. So when the writing is suboptimal, it would be nice to say something like, the writing could be much improved. It could be trimmed down quite a bit. Also, it would be good to have it be vetted by a native speaker of English. And you don't want to say, the biggest problem with this manuscript, which is really simple to live elegantly, is the terrible writing style. When you find a study interesting, it would be nice to say, I'm not sure whether this people will meet with broad interest within the journal's readership. But you don't want to say, why don't you just send copies of this to the two people who care about it and get the publication rate? And when a paper is low in quality, as maybe is often the case, it would be nice to say something like, I don't think this work is right for prime time yet. But you don't want to say, this article reads like the work of a reasonably competent undergraduate, but it's still relatively nice compared to this. I want to vomit. This paper was published. So these are excerpts from actual reviews, and the question is, would those quotes have also been in the reviews when they were accessible to the broader scientific community, signed by the reviewer? So that's from the perspective of the author. There might be some concerns about open review, closed review. From the perspective of the reviewer, there's the issue of credit, which just came up in the interaction question session after Richard's talk. Right now, we're being evaluated as faculty members on research, teaching, admin, but not so much reviewing. Reviewing is considered service to the field, but it's basically something we do in the dark. We don't get any credit for it. There is a way to get credit. There's a website called Publons, which allows you to post your reviews, and you get a verified record of your work, and so you can use that in promotion cases or job applications. That sounds fine, but it would be even better if the reviews were published along with the paper. And there are some journals that have started doing this. One journal is a journal that I'm affiliated with. It's called Collabra, and it's an open access journal that also has the option of open review. So reviews are published along with the paper. And here's an example that Peter Verkoelen was in the audience. Was the editor, and this paper by Dan Simons, and you can read all the reviews of the previous versions of that manuscript before went to publication. But how do psychologists feel about open review? Well, in order to address that, I conducted a survey among 250 psychologists that I approached via the social media, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I don't know how many people actually visit LinkedIn, but and I asked them several questions, or I let them respond to several statements, both just with single options, agree, disagree, and with written statements. So the first question I asked was, as a reviewer, I would like to have my paper published along with the accepted paper. So that's not a question, but a statement. And a majority of respondents agreed with this statement. More than 70% of the respondents agreed, but a significant portion of them, about a third, said, yes, I only want to do it if I can remain anonymous. So it's possible, of course, to have a review published without without signing it. And you might think that tenure has something to do with it. If you have tenure, you're less vulnerable than when you don't have tenure, so you might be more likely to sign a review. Well, that turns out to be true. Here I made a distinction between tenured and non-tenured respondents. The non-tenured respondents are in blue, and what you see there is that a majority of them favor open review, but a considerable part, more than a third, are concerned about lack of anonymity. For the tenured faculty, it's striking to see that a fairly large proportion of them doesn't want open review, much more so than for the junior faculty. And then there's a large portion also that wants to have open review and sign them, so they seem to be a little bit more split. Now, what's the reasoning behind these responses? What we see is that the untenured faculty and the tenured faculty are against open review, largely because they say reviews are intended for the author and the editor and not so much for everyone else. Another point they make is it's too much work to write a review that will see the light of day. People are actually saying, then I have to put a lot more work into things like spelling and grammar and things like that. So apparently that's not an issue when you just communicate with the editor and the authors. And then some people don't see the relevance of open review. I do think that the notion that reviews are intended for a different audience is a very interesting one that requires more thought. Well, here's a quote from somebody who was against open review. A publication quality review requires a lot more investment than just communicating important points to the editor and authors, which increases the cost of doing reviews. That summarizes it nicely. Why are people for anonymous open review? Well, by far the most important reason is that people fear retribution, and this is especially the case for the untenured respondents. In fact, 6 out of 9 tenured respondents were not worried about themselves, but they were worried for the junior faculty. I was quite taken aback by this number, I have to say. So that's another thing that we need to consider. And then there are some junior faculty who are insecure about the quality of the reviews, so they don't want to have them be public. Why are people for signed open reviews? Well, here somebody says, oh no, this is still, actually, this is somebody who is worried, should be against signed open review. As an assistant professor, I'd be worried that publicly signing a review could have negative consequences on my tenure case. And for that reason, I could maybe be too intimidated to provide honest, critical reviews. So that's something to, again, to take into consideration. Why are people for signed open reviews? Well, obviously, the most important criterion is transparency. People think that we gain transparency by having open reviews, but getting credit is another important reason. Getting credit for all the hard labor you put into writing reviews. And some people also think that the quality of the reviews will go up when they are public. So here is an example of somebody who's for signed open reviews. Sign should be transparent in all its forms. I may not like it or even suffer from it, but science, with a capital S, should be bigger than any personal concern. And somebody else says, it would improve the understanding of the paper if the review process was transparent. Furthermore, it would curtail the tendency of reviewers to make outrageous demands of further analysis, data collection without providing proper argumentation. Okay, now editors might be worried that when we have open review, that reviewers will be scared away, and so that they will have a lower likelihood of attracting reviewers or getting reviewers for a manuscript. But actually, what these data, given all the limitations that they have, show is that that really doesn't seem to be an issue. For certain people it will increase, and for others it will decrease when we have open reviews, but for most people it doesn't really matter. Now, another question or statement I put in the survey is from the perspective of an author. As an author, when I submit a manuscript, I'd like to have open reviews. You could think that an author might not like to have their criticism of their work be public. Well, actually, a majority is in favor of having open reviews. So, to conclude, there's a considerable interest in open review, especially among junior researchers. The senior researchers appear to be divided, and anonymity is an important criterion for junior researchers, and there doesn't seem to be an impact on the willingness to review. And as pros of the open review process, people mention transparency, fairness, credit, and quality, and the cons are relevance or appropriateness and an increase in workload. So based on this, I'd be happy to make the following recommendations. Journals should give the authors the option of open review, but they should allow for an anonymous review. It's clear that lots of people are concerned about lack of anonymity. And we need to find ways to give credit to reviewers. So if you had links to all the reviews that we've done and the manuscripts that are associated with it, and you could put that in your promotion and tenure folder, that might be a useful thing, I think. And that's it. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I have one concern with the open reviews, that the reviews are made to a version of the paper that is not the final one. So when the people read the paper and then read the reviews, the two things are not the same. There should be the first version of the paper, the reviews, and then the final version.
So in other words, you say we shouldn't just get the final version of the paper, but we should also get the earlier versions of the paper associated with the reviews along them, and then the final version of the paper. That would alleviate your concern.
No, really, I think that it's better just not to be now open the reviews.
Okay, but you're not explaining to me why, right? You're just saying you don't prefer not to do it, but you don't give a reason why.
No. I mean, what I mean is that I'm fine with having everything open, all final versions and the reviews. I'm fine with it. But personally, I will not read that.
Okay.
I will just
that's what you mean. Okay.
And that's
okay,
it.
Sure, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. Good point. Go ahead,
This is a bit of a follow-up because I think it's unlikely that many authors would want to hear their version of the paper published.
Yeah.
And it is a bit peculiar if you're published reviewing. The reviews of a paper has been substantially changed prior to its final publication. You have to have a full set of the review, the response from the author, and then the subsequent review for the kind of published paper. But I'm not sure how the first review would be very helpful, because the published paper would perhaps bear little relationship. All the flaws that were identified by the reviewer have been corrected before publication. And related to that, I wonder what happens to the reviews for papers that are rejected.
That's a really good point.
The vast majority of the reviewing I do, and maybe I'm kind, but there are lots of papers that are rejected. In any journal, any decent journal, they have something like 70–80% rejection rate. So there are a lot of reviews that are written by reviewers or papers that are rejected. Are you suggesting that those reviews should also be transparent and open? Clearly the papers that are rejected are not going to be published.
Yeah, that's an extremely good question. I don't think we can, I wouldn't recommend publishing reviews of manuscripts that never see the light of day. First of all, you would have published a manuscript. Suppose somebody submits a manuscript to a journal, gets rejected, and then they send it to a different journal. Then you would have the reviews of that first submission already online before the new manuscript is submitted. That doesn't make sense. So I agree that it doesn't make sense to publish reviews of manuscripts that are not published in the journal, but you could still, as a reviewer, post your review on Publons so that you still get the credit for it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of journals will never do see the light of day. But actually, there's a follow-up to the previous question, and that is, which reviews would you publish along with the final paper? Because the final paper could actually not be reflected in the first review or that first submission.
Sure. Yeah. I think you should publish all of the reviews, the whole sequence.
Do you think the authors are happy about their flaws being made public in that way?
Well, apparently in the survey, most of them are. In this survey, which may be...
I just wonder if they were asked this specific question.
I need to move on because we have the next speaker ready to go ahead. Stephan, go ahead.
Okay. What I want to talk about now is a couple of considerations that I want to throw into the conversation about the potential dark side of openness. And some of these thoughts were articulated earlier this year in a commentary in Nature that I wrote with Dorothy Bishop. And I think the cartoon here sums up the dilemma that I'm concerned about quite nicely. On the one hand, we have this key to unlocking science and making it open, but that key can also be a dagger that is pointing at a scientist or science. Now, let me prefix my comments by making it very clear that I think that open data are essential. And everything that's been said up to now about the Pro initiative and sharing data and all that kind of stuff, I totally support. However, I think we need to have a conversation about its full implications. And what I want to focus on are, time permitting, 5 different issues that I can see as being problematic about sharing data. And the intent of tabling this is to allow us to deal with these issues so that data sharing can become more resilient and useful. Now, somebody asked earlier whether federally funded agencies are requiring access to data, and the answer is in the US, yes, the agency must obtain data from the recipients of funds. This is a consequence of the US Data Access Act of 1998 and another one in 2000. And, this all sounds really cool. Data has to be available. Now, what many people don't know is that these acts were drafted by the tobacco industry and that the implementation was actually overseen by a consultant hired by the tobacco industry. So open data is not just a scientific endeavor, but it is also political. It is political the moment you move out of short-term memory and the philological loop into areas that are politically contested. Now, what's the result of open data sometimes in politically contested situations? Well, here's one peer-reviewed example that goes through this. In a nutshell, what happened is that the tobacco industry used access to the raw data to reanalyze a large-scale epidemiological study, and magically the tobacco-related effects disappeared and were replaced with dispositional factors that explain the heart attacks or lung cancer or whatever. This is not an isolated case. There's a mountain of literature out there that this occurs in other issues whenever vested interests are involved, where data are being used during reanalysis, usually outside the peer-reviewed literature, to cast doubt on conclusions. So this raises the general issue when we're talking about sharing data, whether the intentions of the person requesting the data matter. Does it matter if whoever is requesting data wants to go after you, quote unquote? Now, open data advocates, and I consider myself one of them, would say no, the intention should not matter. The tobacco industry said, no, why do you ask? Public health researchers say, oh, it does matter a great deal. And so now we have funny, strange bedfellows all of a sudden. You know, open data in the tobacco industry versus public health researchers. Now, let me walk you through a case, two hypothetical cases, and explain to you why I think that we have to take this very seriously. Here we have one hypothetical case of a Dr. Smith who publishes a paper on the phonological loop or something. Dr. Jones then requests the data from this other hypothetical person and suggests that it's actually leprechauns that cause the forgetting. It transpires that there is animosity involved, that there is some nefarious intent on the basis of Dr. Jones, but ultimately the scientific community resolves the issue. Now, you know, egos are bruised, careers are hampered, people hate each other, but no lasting harm is done, I would argue. So it's perfectly fine that the intent in this case didn't matter. Now here we have another case where the same names are plugged in. Dr. Smith publishes a paper suggesting that product X causes cancer. Dr. Jones comes along, who happens to work for the other people, and replaces that finding during reanalysis with an alternative, and ultimately the scientific community resolves the issue. That sounds just like the first case, but there's one crucial difference, because massive harm is done in this case. Why? That is because the scientific debate is very different from the public debate, and the consequences of the scientific debate on the public are, I think, underappreciated. One of the things we know from a lot of research is that the public and the public's opinion about scientific issues that matter are determined by their perception of a scientific consensus. And the appearance of a scientific debate in public, whether real or not, prolongs public and political indecisiveness. And tobacco control was delayed by decades because of the appearance of a scientific debate in public when there was none in science. And the same is now true with climate change. So, do intentions matter? Well, I think at least you now know why public health researchers are so concerned about the release of data to people who have nefarious intentions. Something we have to consider, something we have to discuss. Another issue that has been mentioned already revolves around consent and ethics. Now, the previous speakers have already covered a lot of these issues. There's a clear imperative to maintain privacy of patients. It turns out that that is non-trivial at times. Anonymization can be very difficult. There's a literature on this as well, and it's surprising how nuanced that can be. And just to illustrate, even delinking identifying information from medical information is considered to be insufficient to ensure privacy in the UK unless the key that is linking the personal data with the research data is either destroyed or kept by a different institution. So it's a non-trivial issue. And the final issue here about consent having been given for only one stated purpose, I think is worth exploring again with a hypothetical example. Suppose Ms. Jones consents to participate in an experiment that observes the effect of work and memory training on IQ. The experimenter collects the usual covariates, as you always do, tick, 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 you know, for completeness, including demographic, ethnic data. The Ku Klux Klan, this is hypothetical, reanalyzes the open data and discovers that black participants had a higher IQ overall, but benefited less from training. Now, as a scientist, you might think that perhaps there's a ceiling effect here, but the Kluxer's trumpet headline the next day is, no matter how much you train them, they can't get smarter. Fox News picks up the story. So let's now go back to this hypothetical Ms. Jones. Suppose she was black. Now, did she realize what she consented to? Would she have given consent to being in the study if she knew this would happen? Would she ever consent to that again? Now, note that the issue here is not anonymity. No one knows that it is Ms. Jones who was in that experiment. But from the participant's point of view, what's the consequence of data being reanalyzed in that manner? And this is the point that we have to accept, that open data means you as a researcher lose control over the data. Well, that's perfectly fine. If you look at the phonological loop or whatever else, I'm just using it as a place marker where, you know, public interest is not overwhelming. But the moment you get into medical stuff, clinical things, intelligence, anything else of societal consequence, we're running into a problem. Now, these concerns are being articulated as we speak. This is a very recent peer-reviewed article that is arguing in favor of increased transparency, but also notices all these risks that I have just gone through. Now, here's another question related to this. Does competence matter of a person requesting open data? Well, bear in mind that researchers operate in an institutional context. We expect them to publish in the peer-reviewed literature, to pre-register. There's ethics boards within the university. We have to submit data management plans. That's for the researchers that are producing the data. But now suppose there's this guy, Richie Wolfe, who runs the Center for Transparency and is dummy. In case you don't know where Richie Wolfe is, it's in Western Australia in the outback. He has none of the above, but he has a blog. And he reveals the truth by reanalysis. Now, this is not hypothetical. This is what actually happens. Trust me. You get data out there of anything not involving the phonological loop, and this is what happens. Now again, the Medical Research Council in the UK has recognized this. In fact, it is being recognized, and we just have to acknowledge that we've got to have safeguards in place for certain types of data to ensure that they're safeguarded to the same standard. Now, very much related to this, let me very briefly go back to my initial hypothetical case about Dr. Jones, who works for manufacturer X, because what I didn't tell you at the time was that until the scientific community resolved this issue, Dr. Jones and manufacturer X published this analysis on blogs and Twitter, and Fox News picked it up. And what happened is that they created a huge amount of misinformation in the public. Now, I know from having studied this for the last almost 10 years that misinformation hangs around forever. And what I'm showing you here are longitudinal data of MMR vaccination rates in the United Kingdom that were depressed because of misinformation that in this particular instance actually came from a peer-reviewed article, but that was amplified and prolonged by blogs and so on, and it cost millions of pounds to get these vaccination rates back up. So a consequence of reanalysis of public health data by vested interests that's been put out on blogs is the creation of a public health emergency. And we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about open data. Now finally, cherry picking. We urge scientists to pre-register their hypotheses for very good reasons. I totally support that, to safeguard against cherry picking and so forth. But we don't keep track at the moment of the Ku Klux Klan, just to use an example, requesting every single data set in the world they can find that records race, and then publishing the reanalysis of only the one that sooner or later, by chance alone, has to show the quote-unquote desired effect. That's also a problem. So what does this add up to in the last minute or so? Well, as I said at the outset, I think science should be open and transparent. But there's a distinction between science on the one hand and a bucket load of other stuff on the other hand: noise, nonsense, commercial interests, the internet, Fox News, or political propaganda. And I would argue that unless we manage it carefully, that openness and transparency not only facilitate science, but actually provide an arguably disproportionate advantage to these other variables out there. So what's the solution? Well, in a nutshell, our proposal, my proposal with Dorothy, that we argued for in the Nature paper, and that I hope we can engage in a conversation, is symmetry. Symmetry of obligation. Now, why should we not request or expect that people who request data are competent and operate in an institutional context of accountability? I think with sensitive data, we ought to do that. Why shouldn't people who request data pre-register their intentions for the analysis? We expect it of researchers. So why do we not expect it of people who want to take the same data and then make some inconvenient effect disappear, or find one that they can use to go after, let's say, ethnic minorities? We must consider the participants' consent, whether we're violating their consent by passing on the data. And I think in order to help with all this, my proposal would be that the availability of data, but also the limits of what is being released, should become part of the peer-reviewed record at the time of publication. So that there's no argument later about who gets the data and how much of it, and etc., etc. And that, of course, to my mind, fits right into the theme today of actually having openness, but robust openness that cannot be abused, and that makes science a better place. Thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions, or I don't know what we do now, Richard. You're the...
Well, let's go 5 minutes.
Okay, questions? Yes, sir.
So I'm just wondering about the sort of architecture that you would put in place to have open data, but it only to be controlled in some way. So you're suggesting what we put on some sort of repository, but that you only give the link to certain individuals, so that it's always there, ever present.
A very good question. And the answer is that is precisely what's happening already in my particular case at the University of Bristol, because we have a data storage facility that assigns a DOI to a data set for 20 years, okay? The facility has 3 levels of access. Open, anybody can just click on it and get it. Controlled, that means you gotta apply for it. And top secret, 007, don't even bother. Okay, now the middle level, the controlled access, the reason that is there is because in the UK, unless your participants have given explicit consent for open data, you cannot share the data openly. It's against the law by my university's interpretation to do so. So that means a lot of experiments that were done at a time when the consent forms didn't have explicit mention of open data are available via a DOI, but only through application. Now, the people who review that application are experts in FOI, you know, they have the Institutional Ethics Board, they have, you know, a bunch of people who deal with these applications, and it is not the researcher's privilege to turn down a request. So, and some of my data are up there with the DOI, that is an application only, and they tell me if there's a request and seek my input, but I cannot veto release if they find it to be. Which I think is important because, you know, you want to take that authority away from the researcher to some extent. But by the same token, you got to have some knowledgeable people in place who govern access with sensitive data. So, and from my point of view, that works really well.
Based on what you're saying about the sort of the use of demographic details, that maybe the intentions change in the reanalysis. Do you think it would be sensible, at least for those of us who are not that concerned with individual differences?
Yeah, I think with a given data set where you're not necessarily concerned with individual differences amongst different demographic groups, that we probably should be avoiding supplying that information. I mean, if next year someone publishes a study showing that the phonological loop predicts murder rates amongst some ethnic group, then suddenly that's a tough.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, and I think I would certainly argue that that's a wise move, not to add demographic information to your data set, unless that's the focus of the analysis. But again, it's a discretionary thing, and I think we have to have a conversation about this. But yes, you gotta, I think as a researcher, you have an ethical responsibility when you share your data to protect as much as possible against opportunistic abuse of your results. And I think that means putting in information that is politically exploitable. Absolutely.
So we were supposed to have a discussion time after the session, but it wasn't. There's nothing in the schedule after us, so we just have this blank spot. And what I would like to do, if you're amenable, is to just open up questions for any of the authors who talked just now. And if you like, we can have a further discussion of these open science issues, and we'll just fill the remaining 20 minutes. You can also leave if you like, but I would love for you to stay and have questions for us if you like. So. Anybody? Yes. Say who your question is for as well.
I think the question is maybe for Richard. So, a very pragmatic question from the point of view of a researcher. What does data mean? Do you mean like the original files produced by the software that you use, or do you mean clean data, and do you include the syntax as well, and how detailed should it be? Like, you know, you export your data from blah blah to blah blah, do you need to include that? I guess yes, but this is like really a lot of work. And what to do with, for example, fMRI data, where just running the syntax takes about 2 weeks, for example, for my data, which is really not doable for reviewers.
So the question is, what do we count as the data? So from our perspective, with the peer reviewers openness initiative, it is what the authors say it is, right? So remember when we said we want the authors to give a reason, and if they say, you know what, we actually did give you the data, and the data are this, we're fine with that, because I think the authors have a sense of what would be useful to share. Now, we also said that we think that what should be shared is whatever is needed to reproduce the analyses that are in the paper, right? So that's the guideline that we would like people to follow. But if you, as an author, say, I am certifying that I am as open as I can reasonably be, that's okay from our perspective, because what we want to encourage is authors to make that decision for themselves, and then we can have a discussion as we begin to open our data sets about what is reasonable, right? So my answer is, whatever you say it is, whatever's reasonable for your research.
Can I add a comment to that, Richard? Because I think that links directly to the last bullet point on one of my last slides, that I think the data availability and what is meant by data and what is enough data, that should become part of the peer review process, and it should be part of the publication, so that there is no debate later on of, gee, you haven't released all your data because, you know, I don't have the scraps of paper on which the subjects wrote their responses, okay? That's why I think this should be done ahead of time. And again, I'm saying this not because I want to be, you know, bureaucratic or anything, but from experience, knowing that the call for more data is being used as a political tool, and that scientists are often accused of withholding data, not because they're withholding the data, but because it's a very effective rhetorical device to arouse suspicion of scientists, right? We had Lamar Smith, a congressman in the United States, recently subpoenaed data from the federal agency that you can download via Google, right? I mean, they're 3 mouse clicks away, but he had to subpoena them because it gave the impression of this agency hiding, as it turns out, climate data. And that's not unusual at all. So one solution to this is to have that debate during peer review and then decide on what it is that's legitimately available. And it's not the author's decision anymore. It's enshrined in the record, and that's a protection against that.
It's been a great afternoon. This is a question for Steve. I just wonder whether, to some extent, your argument about maintaining some control over data in order to avoid it being abused, that argument is a little bit undermined by the fact that people, if they want to, can do all these things on Twitter and blogs and Fox News and so on, just by getting to the primary scientific reports. I mean, so the argument that you make about protecting the data applies to some extent about the actual journal articles themselves. And of course, you know better than me that during the 1960s, a lot of the public debate about tobacco was based on people misinterpreting what had been published in the scientific reports. They didn't have access to the raw data, but they were able to look at the graphs and misinterpret, you know. So I just wonder whether that argument really goes through.
Well, I would argue, I mean, first of all, I agree with you that it's totally possible for published articles to be misinterpreted by people who, you know, were getting paid to do so, or whatever. But I think the possibility for doing damage is amplified if I can get my hands on the data and I can then reanalyze them. And that's easy to do. I mean, you know, I can make tobacco and lung cancer. I can make that association disappear. Give me 10 minutes with R and it's gone. Okay? It's very easy. And I know how it's done because I know how they do it. So, but I think you can't do that damage if you don't have access to the data. Or if you have access to the data, you have to say ahead of time what you're going to do. Because making the association between tobacco and lung cancer disappear is very hard to do if you pre-select your analysis. You cannot write an analysis plan to achieve that. You have to have the data and torture it until the association is gone. And that's why I think having a pre-registered intent of what I'm going to do with data is crucial to avoid that sort of thing.
I want to say, first of all, Steve, I wanted to give you a standing ovation for your talk. That was really fantastic. And a really interesting afternoon for the other speakers too. But the main question really is with data curation and long-term preservation. Because we've talked about making data available and pointing people to where the data might be available, for example, in a part of a paper. People move. They don't necessarily have access to computers. You've got updated computers. Data formats was part of my talk yesterday about how there's sort of data forgetting simply because formats change, computer cloud companies go out of business and so on and so forth. But there's also a cost to data curation, so making sure that data are available long term. So you get the journals to do it. That's a cost to the journals because they have to provide the server space, they have to make sure that people are maintaining those servers and making sure the data are available, the website's available and so on. It goes on a university repository, you have to make sure that the person stays in that university in order to, for long term, for the data to be available in the future. I know that the UK Research Councils require that anybody who is funded by UK Research Council has to deposit their data on a national repository. But people move country, and there's an issue of exactly what format that goes in, and how available it is, how easy it is to reanalyze. And then you could have data stored by individuals on their own computers. And that's vulnerable for all sorts of reasons, for data disk crashes and upgraded software and hardware and so on and so forth. So I wondered if you each had some thoughts about long-term preservation and data curation.
So I guess I'll start. Yes, I do have some thoughts on that. There are a number of high-quality data repositories, well, things that can be used as data repositories. Things like GitHub, which is what I prefer to use, is designed for programmers. It has a lot of it's been around for a while. People trust it. It's not going to go away tomorrow. There are organizations like Figshare, Data Dryad. I don't think these are going to go away tomorrow. So the storage facilities are there, and we have also the institutional repositories. And I think if we support those, then they're not going to go away, right? We as scientists need to be supporting these efforts to have public data repositories and use them. With respect to how do you curate data to make sure that it's usable long term, that really depends on what sort of data you collect, right? And the individual scientists in these fields, I think, have the knowledge to work that out. But it is totally true that that takes time. But it's time that's well spent, because let's say that you are the only person that ever looks at that data, right? If you look at it 2 years, so I'll tell you, I have data from my master's thesis that I know that I went back to like a year ago, and I don't really know what is being represented in that data. I could probably figure it out with maybe a day's worth of work. But I wish I had done a better job of curating that data, because it would make my life easier now. So it does take time to curate the data, but it's time well spent, even if you're the only one who ends up looking at that data, say, a couple of years down the road. Does anyone want to add to that?
No, I just totally agree with you. Yeah, totally agree with that. Whatever time you spend now documenting your data, you'll save next year or the year after or 3 years down the road. There's no question.
Sure. That's a personal curation, but it seems to me that what you're suggesting is that individuals should not try and use their own computers to store them and create the data.
Oh, definitely.
Definitely not.
But my question of curation was long-term curation, not just by the researchers themselves, but by whoever runs the repository. And while some of these commercial organisations might not be going away tomorrow, they might be gone in 5 years or 10 years. And that is a concern.
Well, I'm hoping that the University of Bristol is going to be around for a little longer than that. I mean, they promised me 20 years.
Sure, but some of the cloud services might not be.
Well, so if you use your own personal computer, then you get a new computer, and then it's really gone. So, or you move it in Dropbox, and you forget that you moved it, and then none of your colleagues have access to it.
That's my point. That's exactly my point.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, first, thanks for all of the talks. They were very interesting. And I found especially interesting this idea of the nefarious use of data. But I was wondering if there are two things that go against the ideas that you propose at the end. The first one is that if, for example, register the analysis, if I'm really nefarious and evil, then I ask for something very simple and very easy. I get the data, I run the analysis, and then I say, hey, you only need to ask and register this new analysis. Now you are the tobacco company, and it's going to be very easy. So suddenly, it's trivial to get the same evil results just following the procedure that you propose. And the second one is, well, this is a powerful tool both ways. You are highlighting the idea that some people can make a negative use of the data, but on the other hand, people that publish studies that are biased directly from their funding and the ideas behind are way faster to debunk if you have access to the data. So everything was very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, that's a very good point. I think you're absolutely right. It cuts both ways. But if I suspect that, I have to now create an example on the fly, so it might not be all that good. But if I suspect a researcher to be biased in some way and having performed an analysis that is producing an effect that they really wanted, but it's not actually there, then I would probably be able to write an analysis plan as a requester for data. And for example, I could say, all right, I think this effect is so weak and was so marginal, I would like to look at these data and run a Bayesian analysis on it, rather than frequentist statistics with p equals 0.052. Okay? And because I suspect I would actually get a Bayes factor for the null hypothesis. That is something that I can do. I can write that in an analysis plan. And then I would expect to be given the data to make my point. And that is how we can hold researchers accountable. But that's very different from saying, oh, give me your data. I want your data. And then, I'll find something that I can do to make an effect go away that I don't like, whether it's lung cancer or whatever.
Yeah, so let me just add that it's worth saying that Steve mentioned the idea of symmetry. And as we begin to expect researchers to pre-register their analysis plans, this will cease to be a problem because the original authors are being held to the same standards that Steve is suggesting that the requesters of data be held to. That is, that they are pre-registering their analyses, and so that use of the data will be much harder.
Just one, maybe I explained myself badly, so sorry about that. I was thinking about, okay, for example, I say, okay, I'm really interested in finding, I think that this provokes cancer, and actually it provokes more cancer people that are older and live in rural areas. Okay. I get the data, I run my analysis, and I say, oh, it doesn't work. But what prevents me from actually running every other analysis and giving that information to people who then can pre-register another analysis, but it's not actually a priori analysis. It's based on what I already know, and I told them behind the scenes. Now we have two actors. One is the con, and the other is the evil.
That would be a very difficult thing to prevent. I'm not sure about that. So that sort of nefarious action, that sort of really, that's a conspiracy, right? I mean, that's what's going on. It's hard to prevent people from lying like that. And so, I don't know how to answer that question. But we're actually out of time. So if you want to, maybe we can solve that problem in the next few minutes. But I doubt it. So thank you everybody for coming. It's been a nice afternoon, and maybe I'll see you at dinner.